When we think of ancient Rome, we think of the Romans, of gladiators and combat, the Roman Empire, and an ancient city filled with palaces, meeting places, and a world-famous fighting arena. But there is more to Rome than meets the eye. It was also the home of the early Christians, many of whom died for their religious beliefs at the hands of the Romans. But where and how were they buried?
They couldn't afford to buy large plots of land to make giant cemeteries and things like this, so instead you buy a small plot of land and then dig down.
Extraordinarily, while the Romans were building their massive empire, the Christians were digging subterranean burial spaces with their bare hands. The original catacombs.
So the catacombs are underground burial chambers dug for the early Christians here in Rome.
There was a law in ancient Rome that said you couldn't bury your dead inside the city walls. So the Christians dug catacombs all around the outskirts of the city. The Travel Channel visited San Calixtus, the most extensive of the catacombs of Rome.
San Calixtus is really impressive for the size. It's the largest of these catacombs. The passages carry on for about 12 miles. It covers a space of about 90 acres. And at its height, it could have held up to 500,000 bodies.
San Calixtus is most famous for being the burial place of 16 popes. And this is the room where 9 of them were laid to rest. Some of the ancient popes were martyrs, killed by the Romans because they refused to recant their belief in just one God. The most famous of the martyr popes was Saint Sixtus. He was caught by the Romans celebrating a secret mass here, inside the catacomb itself.
When the Roman soldiers get word that the Pope is down there celebrating this mass, they come pouring in through the entranceways and actually slaughter everyone on the spot.
The catacomb's second most famous martyr is Saint Cecilia. She was executed after converting many pagans to Christianity with her beautiful singing.
She was decapitated, not entirely. They did it with a sword, so they couldn't get her head all the way off.
Her body was laid to rest inside the catacomb, and here is an incredible secret. Years later, when her tomb was reopened, Saint Cecilia's body hadn't decayed. This statue shows how she was found lying in this position, with her hands telling an important story.
She had 3 fingers together on her right hand to signify the Trinity of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and on the other hand, 1 finger raised to represent there is but one God.
Ironically, the catacombs went out of use once Christianity stopped being an underground religion. They are now simply a historical monument to the religion's ancient past. And in case you were wondering about the human remains,
the bones were actually later taken away because tourists, basically, of the last few years would come by and actually take bones home to be relics or just souvenirs.
Perhaps the most amazing thing of all is that San Calixtus is just one of the 60 purpose-built underground cemeteries that have been discovered in Rome so far, making this Catacomb City. Our next stop is Paris, the capital city of France. World-renowned for its distinguished monuments and architecture, it is widely considered to be the European destination to live and die. Paris is home to some of the world's most exclusive cemeteries. Famous figures from across the globe have chosen this city as their final resting place. Included among them are poet and playwright Oscar Wilde and frontman of rock group The Doors, Jim Morrison. In Paris, the celebrity dead have become unlikely tourist attractions for their living fans.
People have always, I guess, come to Paris not only for the city of lights that it is above ground, but also the experience of death that you can have.
The city's deathly attractions do not end up above. Buried deep underground is a macabre secret that many Parisians know nothing about. 60 feet below the most romantic city in Europe is the Empire of Death. Spanning over 100,000 square feet, the Paris catacombs house the bones of an estimated 6 million Parisians. That's 3 times the living population of central Paris today. In these catacombs, human bones have been organized to form a mile-long route of sinister streets and squares.
6 million dead people is so much to comprehend that it almost has to be organized in some way. And so if you have to use the stronger leg bones and the skulls for decorations and things just to give it a bit of a feel anyway that there's some control over it, so be it.
Every year, around 250,000 people visit the Paris Catacombs. They pay $6 each to come on terror tours among the city's dead. This is not a new phenomenon. Ever since the catacombs first opened in the 18th century, people have come here to stare death right in the face. Tour guide Ira Spencer explains this historical fascination.
This was a time when most French people were Catholic, and the Catholic doctrine at that time was such that the more time they spent thinking about death during their lifetime, the less time they would have to spend in purgatory.
So what are the expectations of today's visitors at the beginning of their deathly day out?
I guess it's unusual to think of dead people as a tourist attraction, but here we are, and they are.
As long as anything doesn't fall down or anything jumps out, things will be okay.
And so they begin their creepy tour.
The bones are organized quite nicely down here. The people who were organizing these bones had a bit of a macabre sense of humor sometimes, and they made some humorous formations, including this heart shape here made of skulls. So we're below the metro system, we're below the sewer system, and all this is water that's managed to seep down and land on your head. So here's for a tearful souvenir.
The water was pretty gross when it drops on you. I mean, you don't know where it comes from. So.
I'm amazed how they sort of compress them all so tightly together, and they're all so uniform, they look so the same.
These are the remains of people who once lived and were grieved over, now grouped together anonymously below the earth.
You forget that they're bones because there's so many of them, so it's not as serious as it probably would be if there were fewer and they each had their own story.
Remarkably, the reason behind the construction of the Paris Catacombs is even more disturbing than the tour itself.
When the decision was made to move the bones down here, the cemeteries of Paris were in an awful state.
After 1,000 years of burials, the ground inside the cemeteries had actually lost its ability to decompose bodies.
So when the bodies were buried in the long trenches, they stayed and they rotted and they smelled, and the smell went over the walls of the cemetery and into the city.
And it gets worse.
In 1780, there was a collapse of one of the walls, and this collapse spilled a whole flood of bones into the cellar of one of the houses that stood right next to the cemetery, into the wine cellar, ruined the whole thing. The fumes ruined the house, and that was it. Enough was enough.
A new home had to be found for Paris's downtown dead, and the Paris Catacombs were born. They took their names from the Christian catacombs of Rome. But while Rome's were specifically built as underground cemeteries, the Paris Catacombs are found inside a vast network of underground tunnels that was already there. Ancient limestone mines. Although there are official tours here, the catacombs have always attracted uninvited guests.
It used to be, as we would walk through the walls of bones here, that every once in a while you'd look and you'd see something glinting. You'd actually see that it was a wine bottle that someone had left behind from a party they'd thrown the night before.
If you plan on coming here, you need to follow 3 simple rules. Number 1.
Don't lean back.
People often forget where they are and lean against the fragile bones. You don't want one of these stacks to tumble. Number 2.
Don't wander off alone.
A porter from a local hospital once snuck into the catacombs on his lunch break and disappeared. His body was eventually found 11 years later. And number 3.
Don't take home souvenirs.
Unbelievably, on most tours, visitors try to take home a bone or a skull as a souvenir, but they're always caught.
They make you open your bag and look inside, and if there's something in there that they know you're not supposed to have, they'll either take the bone out, and if it's a small one, they'll just set it aside, or if it's a whole bunch of them, they actually make you do the walk of shame back down and put those things right back where they were before when you found them.
The Empire of Death represents just a fraction of the 156 miles of mine tunnels that are hidden below Paris, the largest catacomb network under any city in the world. Plenty of room, then, for the next century's dead.